The emergency room doors didn't open. They exploded inward.
Whoa! What the
Four
hell?
armed military police
Stop, hold
moved
them
through the
back.
entrance in a tight formation, weapons drawn, eyes sweeping every corner of the trauma bay. Patients screamed. A nurse dropped a tray. Dr. Nathan Cole, chief administrator of Silver Ridge Medical Center, stepped forward with his chest puffed out and his voice already climbing toward outrage. And then every weapon lowered at exactly the same moment. Not because of him. Because of the young woman in blue scrubs crouched beside trauma bed 3, her hands steady inside an open chest cavity, her eyes never leaving her patient. The lead officer removed his cover. 11 minutes earlier, Cole had ordered security to escort her off his floor. He had no idea what he'd just done. Before you go any further, if this story has already grabbed you, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Like this video, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Emily Walker had been awake for 19 hours when the charge nurse handed her a third consecutive overnight assignment without asking. She took it. She always took it. That was the problem, according to Dr. Nathan Cole. Not that she accepted every shift thrown at her, but that she accepted them without the kind of visible gratitude he expected. No thank you, no deference. Just a quiet nod and a return to whatever she'd been doing. Cole found that unsettling in a way he couldn't fully articulate, so he'd settled on a simpler explanation. She was arrogant, young, untested. A 29-year-old ER nurse who'd come to Silver Ridge Medical Center in Ashford, Oregon, with a resume that had gaps in it, gaps she refused to explain, and a manner that didn't fit the mold of someone who should be grateful for the position. Silver Ridge wasn't a prestigious hospital. It was mid-sized, underfunded, and perpetually short-staffed, serving a mid-tier city that nobody from the outside world paid much attention to. Cole had run it for 6 years with a combination of political maneuvering and an instinct for identifying who could be pushed and who couldn't. Emily Walker, he'd decided early on, was someone who could be pushed. He'd been wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. The ER on a Tuesday night in November looked the way it always did, controlled chaos leaning toward the uncontrolled variety. 4 beds occupied, 2 waiting, the triage desk backed up, and a respiratory case in Curtain Bay 2 that smelled like it was about to become something worse. Emily moved through it with the kind of efficiency that didn't look like efficiency. No hurrying, no visible urgency, just a series of decisions made quickly and quietly, one after another. She'd repositioned the respiratory patient before the attending noticed the saturation drop. She'd flagged the chest pain in Bay 4 as a probable STEMI 7 minutes before the EKG confirmed it. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of clinical intuition that either came from years of practice or from something else entirely. Something she didn't discuss. Walker, Cole's voice cut across the floor from the direction of the nursing station. He didn't walk to her. He waited for her to come to him. She did, without expression. He was a large man. Not physically imposing, just occupying space in the way that administrators learn to occupy space, as if the air around them belonged to them by right. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, the kind of tan that came from weekend golf rather than outdoor labor. "I've got a complaint from Dr. Harmon," Cole said, not lowering his voice. "He says you questioned his treatment protocol in front of a patient." "I flagged a contraindication," Emily said. "The patient had a documented sulfa allergy. The antibiotic he ordered. I didn't ask for your interpretation. I asked if you questioned him in front of a patient. I mentioned it quietly. He chose to respond loudly." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. That was another thing he didn't like about her. She had a way of being technically correct that felt like insubordination. "You're a nurse," he said, "not a physician. Your job is to carry out orders, not audit them." "My job is patient safety." "Your job," Cole said, dropping his voice to something that was meant to sound reasonable but didn't, "is whatever I say it is. Are we clear?" Emily looked at him steadily. "Yes?" "Good. Finish your shift and stay out of Harmon's way." She turned and walked back to Bay 2 without another word. Behind her, Cole watched her go with the particular dissatisfaction of a man whose authority had technically been confirmed, but who felt, nonetheless, like he'd lost something. The complaint from Harmon was the third in 2 months. The previous 2 had been similarly constructed. Emily had caught something, said something, and the attending in question had experienced this as a challenge to their competence rather than a flag on a potential error. In one case, the patient outcome had vindicated her within 48 hours. Nobody mentioned that. What they mentioned, in the break room and in Cole's weekly staff meetings, was that Walker was difficult, that she had an attitude, that she didn't know her place. She heard some of it, more than people assumed she heard. The night shift break room was a narrow space behind the medication storage room. 2 plastic chairs, a table that wobbled, a coffee maker that produced something approximately resembling coffee. Emily sat with a cup going cold in front of her and stared at her phone without reading the screen. She had 17 unread messages. None of them were from friends, because she didn't have friends in Ashford. She'd been here 8 months, long enough to know the layout of every floor, the temperament of every attending, the specific way the overhead lights in Bay 6 flickered when the HVAC cycled. Not long enough to have anything resembling a life outside these walls. That was familiar. That had always been familiar. She heard the door open and glanced up. Dominic Reyes, one of the night shift paramedics, came in with a vending machine sandwich and the expression of someone who'd had a worse night than she had. "Cole's on a rampage," he said. He dropped into the other chair without asking permission, which was the thing Emily liked about him. He didn't perform social rituals. Word is he's documenting. He's always documenting. More than usual. Reyes peeled back the sandwich wrapper without looking at it. Heard him on the phone with HR before the shift. Something about performance concerns. Emily absorbed this without reacting. Okay. Okay? He looked at her. "Walker, the man is building a file on you." "I know. And I'm going to finish my shift." She picked up her coffee, reconsidered it, set it back down. "What else would I do?" Reyes studied her for a moment with the look of someone trying to read a map in a language they didn't quite speak. "You're a strange person," he said, not unkindly. "I've been told." He ate half his sandwich in silence. Then, "Where'd you work before this? You never said." "Different places." "Like where?" "Overseas, mostly." "Overseas how? Like MSF? Doctors Without Borders type of thing?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Something like that." She stood, picked up her cold coffee, and went back to the floor. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. She came in, she worked, she was precise and quiet and thorough, and Cole found new ways to make her position worse. She was moved off the trauma track and assigned to overflow, the least interesting, most exhausting section of the ER, a waiting room with beds. She was given the longest shifts with the shortest turnaround times. A written notice appeared in her file about failure to maintain collaborative communication with attending physicians, which was the official version of Harmon's feelings were hurt. She read the notice, filed it, went back to work. On the 4th day, Reyes found her in the hallway outside radiology and spoke quietly without breaking stride. "He's talking termination. I heard it from Martinez in HR. They're meeting Friday." "Friday," Emily repeated. "That gives you 3 days." She nodded slowly. 3 days. She'd survived considerably worse timelines than 3 days, but that was not the kind of thing she could explain to Dominic Reyes in a hospital hallway in Ashford, Oregon. "I'm not going to fight him," she said. Reyes stopped walking. "What?" "Not the way you're thinking." She turned to look at him. "There's no version of this where I win a political fight against Cole in his own institution. He's been here 6 years. He knows where everybody is buried, metaphorically speaking. I'm a nurse with an unexplained resume and no local allies." She paused. "Fighting him directly would be a mistake." "So what? You just let him fire you?" "I didn't say that." She walked away before he could ask the follow-up. Wednesday morning, 6:47 a.m. Emily was 40 minutes from the end of a 12-hour shift when the radio traffic started. She picked it up first. Not the words, just the change in frequency and tone that came through the overhead scanner near the ambulance bay. She drifted toward the window without making it obvious. 40 yards out, she could see 2 Ashford PD cruisers stopped at an odd angle on the access road, and beyond them, the distinctive dark profile of military-spec vehicles. Not National Guard. Something else. She stood at the window for 3 seconds, processing, Then she went to the charge desk and spoke quietly to Lena Park, the charge nurse finishing the overnight. "Who's the senior attending right now?" "Harmon. He comes on at 7. Lena didn't look up from her screen. "Get Dr. Vasquez on the phone. She's the trauma lead." Lena looked up. "Why?" "Because I think we're going to need her in about 20 minutes. Emily moved toward the trauma bay and began pulling supplies without being asked, quietly, methodically. IV lines, trauma shears, thoracic tray, blood products from the refrigerator into a staging position. "Walker," Lena called after her, "what's happening?" "I don't know yet." She didn't stop moving. "But whatever it is, I'd rather have everything ready and be wrong." She wasn't wrong. The radio traffic resolved into words 11 minutes later, and the words were mass casualty. Military convoy, Route 9 underpass, structural failure and secondary detonation, number of casualties unknown. The ER hit a different gear all at once. Not the smooth gear of a well-drilled team, but the grinding, lurching gear of people who had trained for this scenario in classroom settings and were now discovering that classrooms lied. Dr. Harmon arrived 6 minutes early, took one look at the board, and immediately began making decisions that were technically correct and operationally too slow. "We need to establish a primary triage. Already set up in Bay 1 through 4, Emily said, moving past him with a crash cart. "Overflow staging in the hall outside radiology. Blood products are up. I've got 2 surgical residents coming down from 3rd floor. Harmon blinked. "I didn't authorize—" "Do you want to unauthorize it?" She stopped, looked at him directly. "Dr. Harmon, the first units are going to be here in 6 minutes. Tell me what you want to change, and I'll change it." He said nothing. She moved. The first ambulance arrived at 7:23. The patient was a 22-year-old soldier with a penetrating chest wound and a blood pressure that was dropping through the floor. The paramedics were good. They'd kept him alive. But he was running out of runway fast, and the surgical team wasn't down from the OR yet. Harmon looked at the patient and looked at the monitors and looked around the room for someone to tell him what to do next. Emily was already at the bedside. "Tension pneumothorax," she said, her voice flat and certain. "We need a needle decompression now. We should wait for the surgical— He doesn't have time to wait for surgical." She picked up the needle. "I need someone to hold his arm." One of the residents stepped forward. Harmon didn't move. The decompression took 40 seconds. The patient's saturation climbed, his pressure stabilized. Emily stripped off her gloves and turned to the door because the second ambulance had just hit the bay doors and she could hear it. Behind her, the resident said quietly, almost to himself, "Who trained her?" She didn't answer. Over the next 40 minutes, 11 casualties came through the ER. 7 soldiers and 4 civilian workers who'd been on the access road when the underpass failed. Of the 11, 3 were critical. Emily moved between them in a pattern that the residents would later struggle to describe, not because it was flashy, but because it wasn't. She worked in a way that eliminated unnecessary movement, made decisions ahead of the moment they were needed, and communicated in short declarative sentences that left no room for ambiguity. "Pressure's dropping in Bay 2. Push another unit. His airway's compromised. RSI now. Don't wait. The laceration on her left arm is a distraction. Look at her pupils. She's got a head injury. Get CT." Harmon drifted through the room making periodic authorizations for things that had already been done. He was not, Emily thought without judgment, a bad physician. He was simply a man whose training had been built around controlled environments and ordered sequences, and what was happening in this room was neither controlled nor sequential. It was something else. It was the kind of chaos that if you'd seen it in a different context, on a different kind of ground, became almost familiar. She didn't let herself think about that context. Not here. At 8:04, Cole arrived. He came in through the administrative entrance wearing his suit and his expression of managed concern, and he stood at the edge of the controlled chaos for a moment, taking stock. His eyes found Emily at trauma bed 3, both hands working, a young soldier's life running through her fingers one decision at a time. Cole watched for approximately 10 seconds. Then he walked to the charge desk and spoke to Lena in a tone that was meant to be quiet, but carried anyway. "Why is Walker on trauma? I moved her to overflow." Lena stared at him. Dr. Cole! She's not authorized for this assignment. Get her out of there and get one of the residents. The residents are both busy, Lena said carefully. Then get Harmon. Get somebody who's actually qualified. Cole's voice had the tight, brittle quality of a man whose sense of order was being threatened. I don't want her on this case. Emily heard it. She didn't turn around. The soldier under her hands, staff sergeant, mid-30s, a jagged piece of structural rebar that had missed his subclavian artery by a margin she didn't want to think about, heard it too. His eyes were open and tracking, which was both encouraging and heartbreaking. He'd heard someone trying to remove the person keeping him alive. Hey, he said. His voice was rough, thin, barely there. Don't go. I'm not going anywhere, Emily said quietly. Stay with me. Sir, a new voice said from somewhere behind Cole. The administrator turned. Standing near the ambulance bay entrance, still in the road-worn gear of someone who'd come directly from the scene, was a man whose insignia Emily didn't need to see clearly to recognize. The bearing alone was enough. The way he occupied space, not with administrative authority, not with the borrowed gravity of institutional power, but with the particular stillness of someone who had been in places that changed your cellular structure. This area needs to stay clear of non-essential personnel, the officer said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. I'm going to have to ask you to step back. Cole drew himself up. I am the chief administrator of this hospital. Who are you? The officer's eyes moved past Cole to the trauma bay, to Emily specifically, and held for just a moment before returning to the administrator's face. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, something more complicated than surprise. Step back, sir, he said again. Still pleasant, non-negotiable. Cole stepped back. The critical soldier, his name, Emily would learn later, was Corporal Thomas Brandt, was stabilized at 8:31. The surgical team had arrived 4 minutes earlier and had spent 2 of those 4 minutes catching up to what Emily had already done. Dr. Vasquez, the trauma lead, came in mid-procedure, assessed the situation in 30 seconds, and took over the final steps without comment. When it was done, she pulled off her gloves and looked across the bed at Emily. Good call on the thoracic approach, she said. That was all. It was more than Emily had received from anyone in 8 months. She stepped out of the trauma bay and stood against the wall in the hallway, and for a moment she let herself be still. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady the whole time. That was something she'd noticed about herself early in her training, in a place very different from this hallway. The worse it got, the steadier her hands became. She'd never fully decided if that was a blessing or something else. Sergeant Walker, the voice came from her left. She turned. The officer from the entrance was standing a careful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that it didn't feel like a confrontation. He was older than she'd clocked at first, late 40s, something around there. There was a scar along his jawline that she recognized the shape of, because she knew what kind of instrument left that shape. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm Emily Walker, she said. Civilian, ER nurse. Of course, he said. His tone was careful, professional. He had the face of a man who had agreed to something and wasn't entirely comfortable with the agreement. I apologize for the disruption to your facility. We'll have our people out of your trauma bays as quickly as... Colonel, she said. He stopped. She kept her voice level. However you knew to look for me, whatever you found, I need you to understand something. She held his gaze. I am here because I chose to be here. I am Emily Walker, civilian nurse. That's all. The colonel held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. The formality of it was careful, deliberate. He was choosing his words the way you chose your footing on bad ground. He turned and walked back toward the ambulance bay. Emily watched him go. Down the hall, Cole was on his phone, his back to her, gesturing in the way he gestured when he was talking to someone with less power than him. He hadn't noticed the exchange. That was probably for the best. She looked at her hands. Steady. She went to find another patient to save. By 10 o'clock, the immediate crisis had passed into the slower-moving phase. The stabilized patients, the family notifications, the paperwork that hospitals required even in the aftermath of catastrophe, as if documentation could contain what had happened. Emily submitted her shift-end charting with the same thoroughness she brought to everything and signed out to the day team. She was 3 steps from the exit when Cole's voice found her. "Walker?" She stopped, turned. He was standing with HR Director Patricia Hale, whose presence clarified the situation immediately. Hale had a folder. Hale always had a folder when things were formal. "In my office," Cole said. "Now." The office was on the 2nd floor, which gave them a short walk in which nobody spoke. Hale offered Emily a professional, neutral expression that communicated nothing. Cole didn't offer anything. The office was institutional. A desk, 2 chairs for visitors, a wall of binders that suggested organization without proving it. Cole sat behind the desk. Hale took the chair to the left. Emily stood until Hale gestured to the 2nd chair, and then she sat. "I'll be direct," Cole said. He had the folder open, and Emily could see her name at the top of the first page. "We've been reviewing your performance over the past 8 months, and there are a number of concerns, communication issues, failure to follow assigned protocols, insubordination toward attending physicians." He listed them. Emily listened without reacting. "Additionally," he said, "your conduct this morning, taking unauthorized action in the trauma bay, overriding my staffing decisions during an active emergency, constitutes a serious violation of hospital policy." "Those patients are alive," Emily said. "That's not the point." "It seems like the point." Cole's eyes went flat. "Ms. Walker, I'm going to be very clear with you. As of the end of this meeting, your employment at Silver Ridge Medical Center is terminated. HR has prepared the relevant paperwork. You'll be compensated through the end of the week." He pushed the folder toward her. "This is not negotiable." Emily looked at the folder, then at Cole, then at Hale, who was looking at her desk. "I understand," Emily said. Something crossed Cole's face, not satisfaction, not quite. More like the slight deflation of a man who had prepared for a fight and hadn't gotten one. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items," he said. "After that, you're to leave the building." She stood, picked up the folder without signing it. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "You need to sign that," he said. "I know," she said. She tucked it under her arm. "I'll review it first." She walked out. The security escort was a man named Gus, who had worked at Silver Ridge for 11 years and clearly found the assignment embarrassing. He said nothing as they walked to her locker. She took out her personal items, a change of clothes, a water bottle, a book she'd been working on for 6 weeks and was only halfway through. Not much, for 8 months. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, Oregon area code. The text read, "We need to speak. Not about the hospital. Please don't leave Ashford." She stared at it for 3 seconds, typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "Someone who needs to explain why you were assigned here before you make any decisions." Emily read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and finished zipping her jacket. Gus walked her to the main entrance without speaking. At the doors, he stopped and said, awkward and genuine, "That was good work in there today. Everybody saw it." "Thanks, Gus," she said. She walked out into the November air. Across the parking lot, beyond the ambulance bay, she could see 3 military vehicles still staged near the entrance. Different from the first wave, she noted. Newer spec. A different unit insignia on the doors, one she recognized and hadn't expected to see in Ashford, Oregon. She kept walking. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a different number, different area code. And the text wasn't a text. It was a photograph. Low resolution, clearly from a surveillance camera, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. The photograph showed Emily Walker entering a coffee shop on the north side of Ashford. Standing 20 feet behind her, also entering the coffee shop, was a man she recognized. A man she had not seen in 4 years. A man who was, as far as any official record was concerned, serving a federal prison sentence for conspiracy and obstruction of military justice. She stopped walking. The parking lot was quiet around her. Cold air. November sky going gray at the edges. The man in the photograph was supposed to be in a cell in Fort Leavenworth. She looked up from her phone and scanned the tree line at the edge of the hospital property. Old habit. She couldn't help it. 3 weeks ago. She'd been in that coffee shop. She'd had a flat white and read 40 pages of her book and spoken to no one. She hadn't seen him. That was the problem. She was good. She had always been good, but she hadn't seen him, which meant either the photograph was manipulated or she was slipping, or something had changed that she hadn't been told about. Her hands were still steady. She walked to her car, unlocked it, sat down in the driver's seat, and stared at the windshield. She needed to make a phone call. But to do that, she needed to be absolutely certain that the phone she was calling from was clean, which meant her current phone was already compromised just by receiving that photograph, which meant everything had changed in the last 10 minutes in ways she was still calculating. She put the car in gear. In her rearview mirror, Silver Ridge Medical Center receded behind her. Ahead, the military vehicles were pulling out of the hospital lot and turning north, the same direction she was going, or the direction she'd need to go if she was going to do the thing she was already, with deep reluctance, beginning to think she might have to do. She followed them, not closely, just enough to see where they turned. They turned north on Route 9, which told her something, and then east on the Millbrook Connector, which told her more. She knew that road. She'd driven it 3 times in her 8 months in Ashford, twice because she was learning the area, once because she needed to think, and driving was the only way she knew how to do it without going somewhere she'd regret. The Millbrook Connector ran past the edge of the old Hargrove Air National Guard facility, which was technically decommissioned, but technically was a word that didn't always mean what civilians assumed it meant. She pulled off onto a gravel shoulder about a quarter mile before the facility entrance and sat with the engine running and the heat on and watched the convoy clear the gate. The photograph was still on her phone. She'd already made the calculation about the phone being compromised. That was done. That decision was made. But she hadn't yet decided what to do about the man in the photograph, which was the more complicated problem. His name was Garrett Mulvey. He'd been her commanding officer's logistics chief for the last 8 months of her deployment, which meant he'd been in the room for the testimony that had put 7 people in federal custody. He had received 16 months at Leavenworth as part of a plea arrangement she'd been explicitly told about and explicitly told to stay away from. 16 months ended a year and 3 months ago. She hadn't been told he was out. She should have been told. The wind off the valley rocked her car slightly. November in Oregon was not gentle about announcing itself. She pulled out the burner she kept in the glove compartment, an old habit from a life she'd officially left, which was maybe the most honest thing she could say about the complicated relationship between her past and her present, and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was a specific code meaning received, call back in 15. She waited 15 minutes by the dashboard clock. The convoy had disappeared behind the facility perimeter. Nothing else moved on the road. Her personal phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it. When the burner rang, she picked it up on the first ring. "You're a hard person to locate," said the voice on the other end. It belonged to a woman named Adrienne Fosse, who held a position in a federal agency whose name changed periodically for administrative reasons that had nothing to do with what the agency actually did. Emily had known her for 6 years and trusted her in the specific, calibrated way you trusted people who had saved your life but might also, under the right circumstances, decide that your life was an acceptable operational cost. "I wasn't supposed to be located," Emily said. "No." A pause. "Things changed." "Mulvey." Silence on the line. Then, "How long have you known?" "About 20 minutes. Someone sent me a photograph. Surveillance, 3 weeks old, me and him in a coffee shop on Terrace North. I didn't see him, Adrienne." "I know." "Why didn't I see him?" Another pause, longer. "Because he's gotten better, and because you've been living like a civilian for 8 months and your threat assessment is... Look, this is not a productive conversation to have right now." "Mulvey has been surveilling me for at least 3 weeks and nobody told me he was out," Emily said. "That's the conversation we're having. His release was quiet, paperwork issue. We flagged it internally, but the notification chain..." Fosse stopped. "There was a lapse. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Emily watched the empty road. A crow landed on the guardrail 20 feet ahead and considered her car with the judgmental attitude of crows everywhere. "He's not working alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "We don't think so. There's movement in what's left of the network. Nothing solid yet, but enough chatter to take seriously. And then the convoy incident this morning. Fossey's voice shifted slightly. That wasn't an accident, Emily. She'd already known that too, in the back part of her brain that never fully clocked out. The underpass failure on Route 9, the specific underpass, the specific convoy routing. Who planned it? We're still working on that. The good news is most of your soldiers from this morning are going to survive, largely because of what you did. They're not my soldiers. No, Fossey said, and let that sit for a moment. But they are the reason we're running out of time to keep your cover intact. The colonel, Darren Marsh, you probably recognized him. He filed a report within 2 hours of arriving at Silver Ridge. He's not wrong about what he saw. Marsh. Yes, she'd placed him eventually. She'd treated a member of his unit once, 3 years in a different life ago, in conditions she wasn't going to think about in a car on the side of a road in Oregon. What did the report say? That he'd identified a possible match for a person of interest in an active federal investigation. Careful language. He's being careful. Fossey exhaled. The problem is that careful language still triggers a protocol review, and a protocol review means people start pulling files, and some of those files are in places where Mulvey still has contacts. Emily closed her eyes briefly, opened them. So my cover is already burned. Not yet, but the window is closing, which is why... Fossey paused again, and this particular pause had a different texture than the others. Which is why we need you to come in. Come in, Emily repeated. Talk to Marsh. Talk to the JAG team he brought with him. There's an investigator named Reyes. Not the same Reyes who works in my ER. Different Reyes. Major Celeste Reyes. She's been on the network investigation for 8 months. She's good, Emily. She's the one who flagged the Mulvey release. Late, but she flagged it. She wants to meet with you. Emily watched the crow on the guardrail. It hadn't moved. It was either very patient or very stupid, and in her experience those qualities were not always easy to distinguish from a distance. Cole fired me this morning, she said. A beat of silence. I heard. Cole is... Fossey chose her words. Cole is adjacent to some things we're looking at. Probably not intentionally, but adjacent. What does adjacent mean? It means he has a relationship with a defense contracting firm that has a relationship with 2 of the men who were federally charged in the original prosecution. He almost certainly doesn't know the connection exists. But it exists. Emily sat with this for a moment. Cole with his golf tan and his folder of performance concerns and his absolute certainty that he understood exactly what Emily Walker was and wasn't capable of. Cole, who had fired her 4 hours ago from a job she'd taken specifically because Fossey's people had told her it was the safest place they could put her. Whose idea was Silver Ridge, she asked, a pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. It was a committee decision. Adrienne. It was the best option we had at the time. The hospital proximity to the guard facility was a factor. We thought if anything broke loose, you wanted me close to a military resource. We wanted you in a position where we could respond quickly if we needed to. Yes. Emily said nothing for a moment. The crow flew away. When does Marsh want to meet? She asked. Tonight, Hargrove facility. He said you'd know where to find him once you decided to look. She was already looking at the facility gate a quarter mile up the road. I'll be there at 7, she said. Tell him to have coffee. Real coffee, not whatever the military thinks coffee is. She heard something in Fossey's voice that might, in a more sentimental person, have been called relief. I'll pass it along. Well, she spent the afternoon in her apartment, which was a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building on Carver Street that had clean windows and noisy pipes and a view of a parking structure. She'd chosen it because it had 2 exits, front door and a window ledge with fire escape access, and because the building's position relative to the street gave her good sightlines in 3 out of 4 directions. She hadn't unpacked all her boxes. She kept telling herself that was because she was still settling in. She pulled the collar off her nursing badge lanyard and turned it over in her hand. Silver Ridge Medical Center. Emily Walker, RN. 8 months of early mornings and impossible shifts and the particular satisfaction of being underestimated so completely that it became almost restful. She put it on the counter and didn't look at it again. At 6:30, she drove back out to Millbrook and parked on the access road and walked the remaining distance to the facility entrance on foot, which was only slightly less conspicuous than driving, but gave her better situational awareness of the perimeter. The guard at the gate checked her ID against a list she hadn't known she was on and waved her through without comment. Marsh was waiting in a converted briefing room near the north end of the main building. He was standing when she came in, which struck her as deliberate. He'd chosen not to be seated, not to establish himself behind a table. There was a coffee carafe on a folding table against the wall, and 2 cups, and a woman Emily didn't recognize sitting in the corner with a legal pad. "You walked from the access road," Marsh said. "It's a nice evening," Emily said. "It's 34 degrees. "I've been in worse." She poured herself a coffee. It was not good coffee. It was exactly as bad as she'd expected. She drank it anyway. "Major Reyes." The woman in the corner looked up. She was younger than Emily had expected. Early 30s, sharp features, the kind of careful stillness that came from learning to hold a poker face in rooms where the stakes were real. "That's me," she said. She didn't stand. She was assessing, which was fair. "You flagged Mulvey's release," Emily said, 6 weeks after the fact. "I'm not going to pretend that's a success." Emily appreciated the honesty enough to sit down. Marsh took the chair across from her. Reyes stayed where she was. "Tell me about the convoy," Emily said. Marsh and Reyes exchanged the particular look of 2 people deciding how much to share and settling on more than they'd originally planned. Marsh leaned forward. The convoy was transporting personnel from a classified DoD subcontracting review. 3 of the 7 soldiers were specifically assigned to logistics auditing, procurement records from defense contracts going back approximately 6 years. The same procurement chain from the original investigation. The same chain expanded. What Mulvey and his associates were protecting wasn't just the falsified supply records. It was a billing structure that had been running for almost a decade. The prosecution 4 years ago was the tip. The body of it is still active. Emily set her coffee down. And someone knew the convoy was carrying auditors. Someone knew the route, the timing, and the personnel names. That's a significant intelligence leak. Marsh's jaw tightened. 3 of my people are in surgical recovery tonight. One of them, Corporal Brandt, wouldn't be alive if... He stopped. Started again. "We're taking this personally." "You're allowed to," Emily said. She paused. "What do you need from me?" Reyes flipped her legal pad to a specific page. "The original testimony. Your deposition covered the operational fraud, the falsified records, the command structure. But there was a portion of the evidence that was sealed at your request, pending an ongoing threat assessment. Medical procurement records, specifically pharmaceutical billing from 3 forward operating bases over a 20-month period." Emily went still. "The billing records are still sealed," Reyes continued. "You have the access codes. The evidence custodian on record is you." She looked up from the pad. "We need those records, Emily. The auditors who were in that convoy were specifically tasked to cross-reference those records against current contracting activity. If we can connect the old billing fraud to the current procurement structure, we can close the entire network. And if the network knows we're trying to connect them, then the people who have those records become a priority target," Marsh said. "Yes, we know." The room was quiet for a moment. The heating system ticked and knocked. "The access codes," Emily said, "they're not stored anywhere, not digitally." Reyes nodded slowly. "We assumed." "They're memorized. All 12 layers." She looked at Marsh. "If I do this, I need guarantees. Not promises, guarantees. Formal witness protections, new security protocols, and a full accounting of every person who knew my location and position in Ashford." She paused. "Because someone in your chain fed Mulvey enough to put him 20 feet behind me in a coffee shop, and I need to know who that was before I hand anything over." Marsh didn't flinch. "That's a fair ask." "It's not an ask. It's a condition." Another look between him and Reyes. Faster this time. The look of people who had anticipated this and were relieved it wasn't worse. "We can begin the internal review tonight," Reyes said. "Preliminary findings within 48 hours. "And Mulvey's current location?" "Active surveillance as of 4 hours ago. He's in Ashford. We have eyes on him." Reyes's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He made contact with an individual at Silver Ridge Medical Center this afternoon. Administrative level. The information arranged itself in Emily's mind with the cold precision of a diagnosis she hadn't wanted to confirm. Cole. The meeting was brief. Cole's body language on the footage suggests he didn't fully understand who he was talking to or why, but he handed over a document. Reyes pulled a photograph from the pad and slid it across the table. This was captured by a surveillance asset. The photograph was grainy, but clear enough. Cole's parking garage. Cole handing a manila folder to a man whose face was partially obscured, but whose build and gait matched Garrett Mulvey precisely. Cole looked uncomfortable. Mulvey looked like a man who had exactly what he needed. Emily looked at the photograph for a long time. "What was in the folder?" she asked. "We believe it was your personnel file from Silver Ridge, employment records, shift history, your home address." Reyes paused. "Cole fired you this morning. The meeting was this afternoon. The timing suggests Mulvey may have prompted the termination to disrupt your access to the facility and the patients, to isolate you before making a move." Emily sat back. It was a neat enough piece of operational logic. Remove her institutional cover, get her address, put a surveillance asset within arm's reach. Mulvey had spent 16 months in federal custody and had apparently used the time productively. "He doesn't know about the burner," she said, "or the meeting tonight." "We don't think so." "Then we have a window." "A narrow one," Marsh said. Emily looked at the photograph again. At Cole's face, caught in the parking garage fluorescence, that particular expression of a man doing something he wasn't sure was wrong but suspected might be, and deciding that the discomfort was someone else's problem. He hadn't known what Mulvey was. He hadn't known what Emily was either. He'd just known that she was inconvenient, and inconvenient things could be handed off to people who claimed they'd take care of them. "The pharmaceutical records," she said. "They're supplementary files, not just the billing. There are chain of custody logs, internal communications from the base medical officers, and 3 sworn statements I took from enlisted personnel who came to me directly because they were afraid to go up the chain." She looked at Reyes. "Those statements name individuals who weren't charged in the original prosecution, people who are still in active service." Reyes had stopped writing. Her pen was still in her hand, but it wasn't moving. "How many individuals?" Marsh asked quietly. 7. 2 of them are currently holding significant DOD appointments. She let that settle for a moment. "That's why I sealed the records, not to protect myself, to protect the witnesses until the investigative environment was stable enough to bring them forward." The heater ticked. Somewhere outside the building, a vehicle engine turned over. Reyes said very carefully, "Emily, is the environment stable enough now?" Emily thought about Corporal Brandt in surgical recovery, about the underpass and the convoy routing and the specific, deliberate intelligence that had put those auditors in the path of that detonation, about a man who should have been in federal custody standing 20 feet behind her in a coffee shop, close enough to read the title of her book over her shoulder. "No," she said, "but I don't think we're going to get a better window than the one we have right now." Marsh let out a breath that wasn't quite relief. "Then we need to move quickly," he said. "I know." She stood. "I need 24 hours. There's a protocol I have to run through to access the sealed evidence, a verification chain. It can't be rushed without corrupting the authentication, and if the authentication is corrupted, the records become inadmissible." She met his eyes. "I've kept these clean for 4 years. I'm not going to let them fall apart because we're in a hurry." 24 hours, Marsh said. Not a question, not an agreement. A calculation. "There's one more thing." She picked up her coffee cup, considered it, set it down. "The person who tipped Mulvey to my location, someone in your network or adjacent to it. I need that name before the 24 hours are up. I know you're working on it. I'm telling you, I need it." She held Marsh's gaze without hostility, the way she'd held Cole's gaze across a dozen confrontations over 8 months. Steady, not combative, absolutely immovable. "Because if you can't give me that name, I can't rule out the possibility that it happens again. And if it happens again during the evidence retrieval—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marsh nodded once. 48 hours on the identity review. We'll have something." "Good." She turned toward the door, then stopped, looked back at Reyes. The soldiers in that convoy, the 3 auditors, are they going to be able to continue the work? Reyes checked her pad. 2 of them should be operational within a week. The third, a hesitation. The third is critical but stable. It'll be longer. When the first 2 are operational, Emily said, tell them the billing records they were looking for. The ones from the 6-year procurement review. The pattern they're going to find is not in the supply chain. It's in the disposal records. The fraud is structured as overpurchase and resale, not falsified need. The money comes out on the back end. She watched Reyes's expression shift as the implication landed. Tell them to look at the disposal contract specifically. That's where the volume is. Reyes was writing again. Fast now. Emily walked out. Hook. The drive back to her apartment took 11 minutes. She ran a counter-surveillance route anyway, adding another 7, because the operational instinct was back now, and she didn't see the point in fighting it. Twice she took turns that required her to double back, watching for vehicles that matched her pattern. Nothing came up. She parked 2 blocks from her building and walked. The apartment was cold. She'd left the heat low, and she didn't turn it up. She stood at the window and looked at the parking structure across the street and thought about what Reyes had said about Cole and the manila folder and the timing of the termination. Mulvey had been watching her for 3 weeks. He'd assessed the situation, identified Cole as a point of leverage, and used him to disrupt her position with the efficiency of someone who was very good at what he did and who had had a 1.5 years to think about it. She was good too. She had always been good. She was also tired, and 8 months of pretending she wasn't who she was had done something to her edge. Not removed it, but dulled it in specific places, the places where you stayed sharp by exercising the thing you were trying not to be. She went to the kitchen and pulled a glass of water and drank it at the counter without sitting down. Her phone, the personal one, the compromised one, was on the counter where she'd left it. She picked it up and looked at the messages she hadn't read. There were 2 new ones from the unknown number. The first read, "You went to Hargrove. Smart." The second, time-stamped 18 minutes later, read, "The person who told Mulvey where you were isn't in Marsh's chain. Check who signed your Silver Ridge hiring paperwork." She read it twice. Then she opened her email, the work account, the Silver Ridge account, that was technically already deactivated but whose archive was still accessible for the next 48 hours, and searched for her original employment offer. The document was dated 10 months ago. Standard hospital employment paperwork, countersigned by HR and by the department administrator. She'd been hired by Cole's office, countersigned by Cole. But the reference check, the final verification of her nursing credentials, that had been handled by a third-party employment verification firm. Standard procedure, a company called Aldermore Group LLC. She searched Aldermore Group. The results were thin. A minimal website, a registered address in Reston, Virginia, standard corporate language, and 1 employee name and an old trade directory listing that must have been cached before someone scrubbed it. The name was Garrett Mulvey. She set the phone down on the counter. Mulvey hadn't been following her for 3 weeks. He'd been watching her for 10 months, since before she'd arrived. The hiring referral, the reference check, the placement at Silver Ridge, someone had fed him her cover identity before she'd even unpacked her boxes, and he had been patient enough to wait and watch and build a picture while she thought she was invisible. And the convoy wasn't a coincidence or a lucky intercept. Mulvey had known the auditors were coming because he'd known they were coming for her records, which meant he had access to the investigation timeline, not the legacy case, the active one, the one Reyes had been running for 8 months. She looked at the message again. Check who signed your Silver Ridge hiring paperwork. Someone had sent her to that paperwork. Someone with enough knowledge of the situation to know where to point her, and enough investment in her survival to bother. The question was whether that someone was on her side or just playing a different angle on the same board. She picked up the burner, dialed Fosse's number. 4 rings. Voicemail. She did not leave a message. She stood in her cold kitchen in the dark and thought about the shape of the thing she was standing inside, and how much larger it was than she'd been told, and how many directions it was pointing at once. Her apartment door had a standard deadbolt and a secondary chain. She'd upgraded the deadbolt in her second week, old habit. And the chain was a comfort more than a security measure, she knew that. She heard the elevator in the hall stop at her floor. Footsteps. 2 people. Not one. They stopped outside her door. She was already moving before the second footstep landed. Not toward the door. Away from it. Into the kitchen, below the sight line of the peephole, one hand finding the counter edge in the dark without needing the light. She had 17 seconds, maybe 20, before a knock or something worse, and she spent 4 of them running the probability. Mulvey's people, Marsh's people, or a third category she hadn't fully mapped yet. The knock came. 2 knocks. Then a pause. Then one. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That was Fosse's code. Old one. They'd used it during a 6-week operation in a city Emily wasn't going to name even in her own head. But Fosse was cautious enough to use the old ones when the new channels were compromised. She crossed to the door, checked the peephole anyway, and opened it. Fosse was shorter than Emily remembered, or maybe Emily had just been remembering the version of her that wore body armor. She was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no badge visible, and beside her stood a man Emily didn't recognize, late 40s. The particular posture of someone who'd spent years in federal law enforcement and had never fully relaxed out of it. "You didn't call back," Fosse said. "My phone is compromised." "I know, that's why I came in person." She stepped inside without being invited, which was also consistent with Emily's memory of her. The man followed and closed the door. "This is SAC Dunbar, FBI, Organized Crime and National Security Joint Task Force. He's been read in." Dunbar extended a hand. Emily shook it. His grip was neither aggressive nor performatively gentle, just a handshake, which she appreciated. "Aldermore Group," Emily said. Fosse looked at the man she'd brought and then back at Emily. "You found it." "Someone pointed me at it. Someone who texted an anonymous number and knew enough to know where to look." She kept her voice even. "Was that you?" "No," Fosse said, and then, after a beat, "It was Rhea's, Celeste. She found the Aldermore connection 6 hours ago and didn't want to sit on it until morning." Emily filed that. Reyes had flagged the Mulvey release late, but she'd also moved fast when she had something. That was a particular kind of person. Not perfect, but genuinely trying, which was more useful than perfect in Emily's experience. "How deep does Aldermore go?" she asked. Dunbar answered. His voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone who had given this briefing before and stripped it of everything unnecessary. Aldermore Group is a shell entity registered in Virginia, 3 ownership layers deep, ultimately controlled by a holding company with DoD contracting relationships going back 9 years. It's been used to place at least 4 individuals in positions adjacent to federal investigations. Hospitals, contracting firms, 1 city planning office in Maryland that had a zoning issue touching a defense logistics depot. "They place people," Emily said, "as employees. As employees, as consultants, as volunteer board members in 2 cases. The placement creates access to information, to personnel files, to physical proximity." He paused. "Your placement at Silver Ridge was deliberate. Someone fed Mulvey your cover identity before your relocation was finalized, and Aldermore was activated to ensure your employment, to put you somewhere accessible and isolated." "Cole didn't know," Emily said. "Cole knew nothing. He received a recommendation from a staffing agency that Aldermore had already seated with a contact, standard HR process, properly documented." Dunbar's expression was professionally neutral. "He is, however, about to have a very difficult conversation with federal investigators about the document he handed over in that parking garage." Emily moved to the window, not standing directly in front of it, positioning herself to the side where she could see the street below without being silhouetted. Old habit, same as the rest of them. "Mulvey has been building toward something," she said. "He didn't spend 10 months watching me just to retrieve a personnel file. The convoy, the auditors, the timing. He's trying to prevent the pharmaceutical records from being authenticated. If those records go into evidence, the billing structure collapses and the active network loses its funding mechanism." She turned. "How many people does he have in Ashford right now?" Fosse and Dunbar exchanged the look she was starting to recognize as their version of the look she and Marsh had exchanged. The look of people managing how much to release and when. "We've identified 3 confirmed associates," Dunbar said. "Possibly a 4th. They've been in place for approximately 2 weeks. Armed? Almost certainly. And Mulvey's endgame is the records, which means his window is the same as ours. She looked at Fossey. 24 hours just became a problem. We know, Fossey said. I need to start the verification chain tonight, not tomorrow. Fossey didn't argue. That told Emily something about how seriously they were taking the timeline. What do you need? Secure Terminal, the verification protocol, uses a closed federal system. It can't be run on civilian hardware. I need access to a SIPR node. She paused. Hargrove has one. Marsh can authorize the access. I'll make the call, Fossey said, pulling out her phone. While Fossey stepped into the hallway, Dunbar stood in the middle of Emily's apartment and looked at the boxes she hadn't unpacked and the single-framed photograph on the otherwise bare wall. A landscape, mountains, somewhere cold, nothing personally identifiable, and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. She'd give him that. The internal leak, Emily said. The person who fed her cover to Mulvey 10 months ago. Do you have a name? Dunbar looked at her carefully. We have a strong lead. That's not a name. No, he agreed. It's not, yet. Something shifted in his expression, not evasion exactly, more like the discomfort of someone who had a name and was not yet authorized to say it. By morning, she decided to accept this and move on, because the alternative was standing in her cold apartment arguing about information she couldn't extract by arguing. Fossey came back in. Marsh is authorizing the terminal access. He wants you at Hargrove in 90 minutes. A pause. He also said to tell you he has better coffee this time. He doesn't, Emily said. But let's go. Buzz him. The SIPR terminal was in a room that smelled like old carpet and metal, tucked behind 3 security doors in the facility's north wing. A specialist named Tron ran the access protocols without asking questions, which Emily found professionally admirable, and then left them alone with the terminal and a door that locked from the inside. The verification chain for the sealed evidence took 40 minutes to run. 12 authentication layers, codes, biometric confirmation via a secondary reader Marsh had sourced from somewhere, 2 challenge response sequences that required Emily to answer questions about the original case using specific terminology from sealed depositions. It was not elegant, it was not fast. It was thorough in the way that things built by people who understood what was at stake were thorough, with the assumption that someone would eventually try to break it, and the patience to make breaking it not worth the effort. When the final layer cleared, the system displayed a single confirmation. Evidence package Walker 7. Access granted. Custodial transfer pending secondary authorization. Reyes was in the room by then, seated to Emily's left with her legal pad replaced by a laptop. She looked at the screen and let out a breath she'd been holding for a while. The pharmaceutical records are in there, Emily said. Everything I described. Billing falsifications, disposal contracts, the sworn statements. She looked at the screen. The 3 enlisted personnel who gave statements, their names are sealed inside the package. Before this goes anywhere, I need personal notification protocols in place for each of them. We can have those drafted by morning, Reyes said. Draft them now, Emily said. Not harshly, just the way you said things when the margin was gone. Because if Mulvey has the active investigation timeline, he may have their names too. The statements were sealed, but the fact of their existence was referenced in the original prosecution filing. Reyes was already typing. Good. Marsh was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms crossed, watching Emily work with the expression of a man recalibrating something. She'd noticed it earlier and had filed it as not immediately relevant. Now, with the adrenaline of the verification chain settling into something tiredness adjacent, she noticed it again. Say it, she said, without looking at him. Say what? Whatever you've been deciding whether to say for the last hour. Marsh was quiet for a moment. I've been running the timeline. 10 months of Mulvey watching, the convoy, the placement, the level of coordination this took. He paused. The leak we're looking for isn't low level. Someone with access to your relocation package, your cover identity, the investigation timeline. That's a very short list. I know, Emily said. The list includes people in my chain. I know that too. He looked at her directly. How are you not? He stopped, started differently. Most people in your position would be. Furious? She turned to look at him. I am furious. I've been furious since I saw that photograph. But fury is not currently useful, so I'm not leading with it. She held his gaze. Tell me who's on the short list. He told her. 4 names. She listened without interrupting, filing each one against what she knew, what she'd observed, what she'd been told over 10 months of living inside a cover that someone had compromised before she'd even unpacked. When he finished, she said, the 3rd name, Garrison. Marsh went still. He was on the original prosecution support team, Emily said. He handled logistics for the JAG office during the trial. I never interacted with him directly, but his name is in the background of 3 of the administrative filings. She paused. He'd have had access to my relocation paperwork if he stayed in the support role afterward. He did, Marsh said. His voice had flattened. Then start there. The knock came at 2:47 a.m. Not on the door of the secure room, on the facility's main entrance, forceful, followed by a voice on the external intercom that identified itself as a DOD Inspector General Field Team conducting an unscheduled compliance review. Everyone in the room heard it through the building's intercom relay. Marsh straightened immediately. Reyes looked up from her laptop. Emily looked at nobody because she was already running the probability again, and this time it resolved faster and the answer was worse. IG teams don't run unscheduled compliance reviews at 2 a.m., she said. No, Marsh agreed. He was already moving toward the door, phone in hand. And if someone wanted to know whether the evidence package had been accessed, they'd trigger a facility response that would confirm whether we were here, Reyes finished, her voice tight. She got it. The intercom crackled again. Still the same voice. Still IG. Still compliance review. Still patient. Marsh spoke quietly into his phone. Emily heard him say, lock the perimeter. Nobody in or out until I confirm identity through DC. Then he looked at Emily. How long until the secondary authorization completes? It's not a timer. I have to run a secondary verification through a different channel. Physical access code stored off-site. She kept her voice level. 30 minutes if I have secure communications. Longer if I don't. You'll have them. He moved to the door, stopped. Dunbar's at the entrance. He'll run the IG identification process. It'll buy time. How much time? Enough, he said, with the voice of someone who wasn't certain that was true. He left. The door locked behind him. Emily turned back to the terminal. Reyes came to stand beside her, not crowding, just present. The access codes, Reyes said. They're memorized. All 12 layers. Yes. If something happens to you before secondary authorization, it doesn't complete, Emily said. The package stays sealed, admissibility intact but inaccessible without the custodial codes. She was already running through the secondary protocol in her head, sequence by sequence, because this was not the moment to discover she'd misremembered something. The only way to unlock it without me is a court order and a 6-month evidentiary review process. Which Mulvey knows. Which Mulvey knows. They stood side by side in the cramped room that smelled like old carpet and metal, listening to the building. For a moment, nothing. Then the facility's external alarm, not the general alarm, the perimeter breach alert, a specific tone Emily recognized from the facility specs Marsh had gone through at the start of the meeting, a tone that meant someone had gone over or under a fence line on the north side. Reyes looked at the door. Emily looked at the terminal. 30 minutes of secondary authorization, perimeter breached, Dunbar at the main entrance stalling an IG cover story that had just become simultaneously less important and more dangerous. Can you run the secondary protocol from memory? Reyes asked. Yes. How much of your attention does it take? Emily considered this honestly. Most of it. Then work, Reyes said, and pulled a firearm from a holster Emily hadn't clocked until that moment. She moved to the door and positioned herself to the left of it, back to the wall, weapon at low ready. I'll handle the door. There was something Emily could have said about Reyes's positioning. The angle was slightly off. She was crowding the hinge side rather than the latch side, which gave better reaction geometry. But Reyes was clearly competent, and the observation was marginal enough to skip. She turned to the terminal, started the secondary protocol. The The building was not quiet. She could hear through the walls voices and movement, not panic, controlled urgency, which meant Marsh's people were responding to the perimeter breach in an organized way. That was good. Organized response bought time. She needed 22 minutes. She'd estimated 30 earlier, but she knew the protocol better than she'd implied. She'd run through it in her head more times than she could count over 4 years, the way you maintained something you couldn't afford to forget. She was 11 minutes in when the lights went out. Not all of them. Emergency backup came on in 4 seconds. Red-tinted, dim, enough to see the terminal screen, but not enough to read the small text easily. The terminal itself stayed live. It was on isolated power, which she'd checked before starting. Reyes said nothing behind her. Emily heard her shift her weight and knew she was still at the door. 14 minutes. A sound from the hallway. Not a knock this time, not a voice. Something lower. A metallic scrape that could have been equipment, could have been a door handle, could have been a dozen things, and was definitely not nothing. Rhea's voice was very quiet. Stay on the protocol. I am. 16 minutes. The secondary system was processing the authentication request, a handshake between the terminal and a federal evidence custodian server, running through 6 encrypted relay points. It was not a fast process by design. 17 minutes. The door handle moved. Not tentative, deliberate. Someone testing whether the lock was engaged. Reyes raised her weapon. Emily kept her eyes on the screen and her hands on the terminal and thought about Corporal Brandt in surgical recovery and the 3 enlisted personnel whose names were inside a sealed package, and the 7 years she'd spent carrying something that was too heavy to set down and too important to drop. 19 minutes. The door did not open. Whoever was on the other side, one person, Emily thought, from the sound profile, had found the lock and had not yet decided what to do about it. 21 minutes. The terminal screen changed. Secondary authorization. Processing complete. Custodial transfer. Confirmed. Evidence package. Walker 7. Released to investigative authority per Federal Preservation Protocol. Emily's hands were steady on the keyboard. She typed the final confirmation sequence. 12 characters, memorized, never written down, and hit enter. Transfer complete. Package integrity. Verified. She stepped back from the terminal. Behind her, Reyes said, "Done?" "Done." The sound from the hallway had stopped. Whether that was good or bad depended on what had stopped it, and Emily didn't know yet. The emergency lighting made the room look like the inside of something that hadn't decided yet whether it was safe. Her phone, the burner, the clean one, vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. Fossey. North breach contained. 2 individuals in custody. Dunbar confirmed fake IG team. 3 more outside. We have a problem. Emily typed back. What problem? The response came in 8 seconds. The fake IG credentials trace back to a current DOD Inspector General employee. Active, credentialed, senior level. This isn't Mulvey's network operating independently. Emily stared at the screen. Someone inside the IG's office ran this tonight. Someone who knew you were here and knew what you were doing and had enough authority to generate convincing federal credentials in 4 hours. She looked at Reyes, who was reading over her shoulder and whose face, in the red emergency light, had gone somewhere complicated and still. "Garrison," Emily said. Reyes said nothing for a moment. Then, "Garrison has a contact in the IG's office. We knew that. We assessed it as low risk." She paused. "We were wrong." The building was starting to sound more normal. Voices, movement, the return of the white overhead lights as someone restored main power. The crisis was contracting to the size of a problem instead of a catastrophe. That was something. But Garrison had run a federal cover operation against them tonight from inside a government office, which meant the network's reach was longer and higher than the investigation had mapped, which meant the 7 names inside Evidence Package Walker 7 were connected upward to something that had the capacity to generate fake Inspector General credentials on short notice. And Garrison, whoever had warned Emily about the hiring paperwork, whoever had texted an anonymous number and pointed her at Aldermore, Garrison was the name Marsh had given her as a suspect, which meant either Marsh was wrong about Garrison or the person who'd warned her tonight was someone else entirely. Or Garrison was running both sides of this, which was a possibility that made everything Emily thought she understood about the last 10 months rearrange itself into a shape she didn't like at all. Her burner vibrated again. This time it wasn't Fosse's number. It was the same unknown number that had sent her the photograph. The same one that had pointed her at the Aldermore paperwork. The message was 4 words. Don't trust Colonel Marsh. She read the message twice, then put the phone face down on the terminal desk and stood very still for a moment, thinking. Reyes was watching her. What is it? Emily turned the phone over and held it up so Reyes could read the screen. Reyes read it. Her expression didn't collapse or spike. It settled the way expressions settled when something confirmed a suspicion that had been sitting unexamined in a corner. How long has this number been contacting you? Since this afternoon. It pointed me at the Aldermore connection. It told me not to leave Ashford. Emily set the phone down. It knew things about my situation that required either direct access to the investigation or proximity to someone who had it. Or both, Reyes said. Or both. They stood in the room with the restored overhead lighting, making everything look flat and institutional, and Emily did the thing she'd learned to do in the field when the situation reconfigured itself at speed. She stopped building on the previous map and started drawing a new one from what she could actually verify. What she could verify, Marsh had given her Garrison's name as a suspect. The anonymous source had suggested Garrison as a path to Aldermore, which had turned out to be accurate. The fake IG operation tonight had used credentials that traced back to the real IG's office, where Garrison had a contact. And now the same anonymous source was telling her not to trust Marsh. The logic of it could go 2 ways. Either Garrison was the leak and was now running a counter-operation to muddy the water by pointing her at Marsh, or Marsh had given her Garrison's name specifically to deflect from his own involvement, and someone else was trying to correct that misdirection. Neither interpretation was comfortable. Both were operationally possible. I need to talk to Dunbar, she said. Why Dunbar? Because he's FBI and he's outside Marsh's chain of command, and he's been read in on enough to have context. She picked up the burner. And because whoever is texting this number is watching tonight's operation closely enough to know what happened in real time, which means they're either inside this facility or they have eyes on it, and Dunbar has been managing the external perimeter. Reyes absorbed this. You think the source is outside. I think the source is somewhere nearby and has been the entire night. The timing on the messages tracks with physical observation of this building, not with remote access to intelligence feeds. She moved toward the door. Stay with the terminal. Don't let anyone access the transfer logs without my authorization or Dunbar's. And if Marsh asks? Emily stopped at the door and looked back. Tell him the secondary authorization requires a cooling period before the transfer logs are accessible. Standard evidentiary protocol. She paused. It doesn't, but he might not know that. She could see Reyes filing this the same way she filed everything, carefully, without editorializing. Okay, Reyes said. Emily opened the door and went to find Dunbar. He was in the main corridor near the facility entrance, in conversation with 2 of Marsh's security team and a woman Emily didn't recognize who had the particular bearing of someone from the federal attorney's office. That specific combination of exhaustion and precision that came from being called in at 2 a.m. and deciding to function anyway. Dunbar saw Emily coming and said something brief to the group, and they dispersed with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that certain conversations required fewer witnesses. The 2 in custody, Emily said when she reached him. What are they saying? Nothing useful yet. Lawyers incoming within the hour. Someone made calls fast, which tells you something about the level of support behind this operation. Dunbar's voice was its usual flat precision, but there were edges under it now. The edges of someone who'd been awake too long and had processed too many variables. The IG credentials were authenticated by a senior field operations coordinator named Wallach. He's been with the IG's office for 11 years. We have agents at his home now. Was Wallach coerced or willing? We don't know yet. Dunbar studied her. What's on your mind? She showed him the phone. He read the message. His expression did the same thing Reyes's had done. Settled rather than spiked. The calibration of someone adding a data point to an existing model. When did you first receive contact from this number? He asked. She walked him through the timeline. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she watched him work through the same two-way logic she'd already run and arrive at the same place she had. Not resolution, but a sharper definition of the problem. Marsh's access to your relocation package, he said finally. His chain of command would have included it. Yes. That doesn't make him the leak. No, Emily agreed, but the message is specific. It doesn't say be careful or verify. It says don't trust, present tense, active. She paused. Whoever's sending this has a specific concern about what Marsh is going to do next, not what he's done. Dunbar looked at the phone again. Tonight's operation, the breach, the fake IG team. What did Marsh do when the perimeter alarm triggered? Emily thought back. He left immediately, went to manage the response. He was gone for about 20 minutes before you sent the first update. Dunbar was quiet again. Then, the two individuals we took into custody at the north perimeter, we found them fast, within 4 minutes of the alarm. He seemed to be working toward something. The breach point they used was specific. They went directly to the north fence at the exact location of a gap in the motion sensor coverage, a gap that exists because of a maintenance issue logged internally 6 days ago. Emily understood where this was going. That gap's location isn't on any public document. No, Dunbar said. It's in an internal facility maintenance log, accessible to senior personnel with facility authorization. He looked at her steadily. Marsh has facility authorization. Neither of them said the next thing, because saying it made it the kind of accusation that had weight and consequence and needed more than a chain of implications to support it. But the shape of it was in the corridor between them, solid enough to navigate around. I need his communications log from the last 6 hours, Emily said. Not a request. I'm telling you what I need so you know what to work toward, whatever channel you have inside the FBI liaison here. I'll see what I can pull without triggering a formal review that tips anyone off. He paused. What are you going to do? I'm going to act as if everything is normal until it isn't. That's a thin strategy. I know. She took the phone back. But the evidence transfer is complete. Walker 7 is in federal custody now, authentication intact. Whatever Marsh is or isn't, whatever the source of this message is or isn't, the records exist, they're verified, and they're out of my hands. That's the most important thing that happened tonight. Dunbar nodded slowly. You should know. Reyes filed a preliminary report an hour ago based on your description of the disposal contract structure. The two auditors from the convoy who are operational, they were debriefed at approximately midnight. They started pulling disposal records at 1 a.m. He checked his watch. They've been at it for 90 minutes. And? Early returns suggest the billing volume is significant, significantly larger than the original prosecution estimated. A pause. We're talking about a structure that pulled approximately $40 million over 8 years through falsified disposal certifications. $40 million. Emily had known it was large. She hadn't known it was that large. The number recontextualized certain things: the level of coordination, the patience, the willingness to run a 10-month surveillance operation and stage a highway incident and generate fake federal credentials. $40 million bought a great deal of patience and a great deal of willingness. Then there are people with significant resources invested in stopping this investigation, she said. Yes, Dunbar said, which means tonight probably isn't the last attempt. She already knew that. Knowing it didn't make it more manageable, but it made it more concrete, and concrete problems were easier to work with than abstract ones. She went back inside. Marsh returned to the briefing room at 3:40 a.m., and Emily watched him walk in with the eyes of someone who was no longer sure what she was looking at. He looked tired. That was real. The kind of tired that wasn't performed. His jacket was dusty from the perimeter, and he had a scrape along his left forearm that he'd wrapped with what looked like medical tape from a field kit, which meant at some point in the last hour, he'd been close enough to the north fence to pick up a cut. That could mean he'd gone to the perimeter himself to manage the response. It could mean other things. 2 in custody, he said. 3 more fled before we could close the perimeter. We have ID on one of them. A man named Price, former logistics contractor. Multiple prior associations with the Mulvey network. He sat down. The IG credentials are being traced now. We'll have the authorization chain by morning. Wallach, Emily said. Marsh looked at her. You heard. Dunbar updated me. Something passed across Marsh's face. Not guilt, not calculation. Closer to fatigue, the specific fatigue of a man managing multiple threads in a situation that kept adding threads. Wallach's involvement suggests this goes higher than we originally assessed. The IG's office has oversight authority over the original prosecution. If someone inside that office wanted to interfere with evidence authentication, they'd have the standing to challenge the transfer's admissibility, Emily finished. Yes, I know. She kept her voice neutral. That's why the secondary authorization chain includes a verification timestamp from a federal evidence server that the IG's office has no jurisdiction over. Whatever Wallach's involvement, it can't touch the transfer record. Marsh nodded. He looked, she thought, slightly relieved by that. She wasn't sure yet whether the relief was the relief of a man worried about the investigation's integrity or the relief of a man who just learned that a particular avenue of interference was closed. She hated thinking this way about him. She'd been in enough situations to know that suspicion without evidence was its own kind of corruption, the kind that made you treat everyone like a threat and ended with you trusting nobody and achieving nothing. But the anonymous message was specific, and the maintenance gap was specific, and the timing of his absence during the perimeter breach was specific, and she'd learned a long time ago to take specific things seriously even when she didn't want to. I want to see Mulvey's current surveillance feed, she said. Marsh frowned slightly. Why? Because 3 of his people just ran a facility breach, and 3 of them are still in the field, and I want to know if his position has changed in the last 2 hours. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Fair? I'll pull it up. He pulled it up on his laptop. The feed showed a residential street on the east side of Ashford, a dark sedan parked outside a rental property, no movement. The timestamp was current. He hasn't moved, Marsh said. Emily looked at the feed, the sedan, the dark windows, the empty street. Who's running the surveillance? She asked. 2-person team from the facility. They've been on him since... Can you get them on comms right now? Live confirmation? Marsh paused. A brief pause. A pause that was small enough to dismiss and large enough to notice. Of course. He reached for his radio, keyed it. Watkins, status on the east side asset. Static. Then, asset stationary. No movement since 2100. Emily listened to the voice. She'd only heard it once, briefly, when she'd passed 2 of Marsh's people in the corridor earlier. She wasn't sure it was Watkins. She also couldn't prove it wasn't. She let it go. For now. I'm going to sleep for 3 hours, she said. There's a bunk room on the south side. Second door on the left. She stood. Wake me if anything changes. She went to the bunk room and lay down without sleeping because sleeping was not an option and she hadn't intended it to be. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and ran the whole thing again from the beginning, slowly, the way you debugged a complex system, looking not for what was wrong but for what was impossible. The things that couldn't be true, given what else was true. By 4:30 a.m., she had 2 things she was fairly sure were impossible. The first was that Mulvey had gotten the maintenance gap information from Garrison. Garrison's contact at the IG was Wallach. She'd confirmed that through Dunbar. Wallach's jurisdiction was evidentiary oversight, not facility operations. He wouldn't have access to Hargrove's maintenance logs, and even if he did, passing them to Garrison to pass to Mulvey on the timeline of tonight's operation was too many links in too little time. The second was that the anonymous source was working for Mulvey. If they were, the Aldermore connection would have stayed hidden. Pointing Emily at Aldermore had accelerated the investigation, not impeded it. So the anonymous source was working against Mulvey, and the maintenance gap information had come from someone with direct facility access who wasn't Garrison. At 4:47, her burner buzzed again. Check what Marsh filed with DOD at 11:15 p.m. Before the perimeter alarm. Subject line will read, Operational Status Update. Ask Dunbar to pull it. She stared at the ceiling for 30 seconds. Then she got up, went to find Dunbar, and asked him to pull it. He came back with it at 5:20 a.m., and the expression on his face when he handed her his phone to read was the expression of a man who had been doing this work for a long time and still found certain things genuinely surprising. The filing was brief. Standard operational update format, time-stamped 11:15 p.m., 2 hours before the perimeter alarm, 40 minutes after the Hargrove meeting had concluded. It was addressed to a DoD oversight coordinator in the Logistics Review Office. The body of the report described the meeting at Hargrove, the evidence transfer protocol in progress, and in a subordinate clause that was easy to read past if you weren't looking for it, the estimated completion time for the secondary authorization, which had been, at the time of the filing, approximately 2:45 a.m., the same window during which the north perimeter had been breached. Dunbar said, he filed a real-time status report to a DoD coordinator while the evidence authentication was in progress. To a DoD coordinator who we need to identify, Emily said. Already on it. He took his phone back. The report itself isn't necessarily wrong. There are legitimate reasons to file operational updates during active evidence procedures. But the specific detail of the completion estimate on this timeline to this specific office is enough to open a formal inquiry, Emily said. Yes. She sat with this. The problem with a formal inquiry was time. It was a process that took days or weeks, and she had hours. And in those hours, Marsh was still running security for the facility and still had access to the surveillance feeds and still had the ability to shape what information reached her and what didn't. I need Fosse, she said. Dunbar nodded and made the call. Fosse arrived at the facility at 6:10 a.m., looking like someone who had not slept and had decided that sleep was a problem for a future version of herself. She read the filing. She read Dunbar's preliminary notes on the DoD coordinator. She read the timeline of the perimeter breach. Then she set everything down on the table in the small side room they'd commandeered and looked at Emily. If we move on Marsh now, we tip the coordinator, she said. If we don't move on Marsh, we have a compromised security lead on an active evidence transfer, Emily said. The transfer is complete. The transfer is complete, and the network knows it's complete, and they know exactly what's in it because Marsh told them everything except the actual content of the records, which he didn't have access to. Emily felt the tiredness in her joints now, the particular heaviness of a body that had been running on adrenaline and was beginning to present a bill. The records are authenticated and in federal custody. But the network is going to challenge their admissibility, and they're going to build that challenge around the integrity of this facility's security during the transfer window. They'll argue the chain of custody was compromised. Fosse looked at her. Is it? Was the chain compromised? Not technically. The authentication ran through independent federal servers. The perimeter breach didn't touch the terminal room. She paused. But a defense attorney with the right information can make technical non-compromise sound like technical compromise to a judge who's hearing about a facility breach on the same night as an evidence transfer. The optics are what they're going after. Fosse was quiet for a moment. So we need to get ahead of the optics. We need to get Marsh on record, Emily said, before he knows we're looking at the filing. A voluntary statement about his communications during the transfer window, made before a formal inquiry, is different from a compelled statement after one. Voluntary statements are much harder to walk back. Fosse studied her. You want to interview him now. I want you to interview him now with Dunbar. Routine operational debrief, standard after a perimeter breach and custody situation. He won't refuse a routine debrief. It would look wrong to refuse. And you? I'm going to be in a different room having a completely different conversation. At 6:45 a.m., while Fosse and Dunbar were conducting what they'd framed as a routine post-incident debrief with Marsh in the main briefing room, Emily sat in the communications office with Reyes in a direct line to the DODIG's office. Not Wallach's line, a different one, a line that Reyes had identified through a careful reading of the IG's organizational chart as belonging to Deputy Inspector General Patricia Morse, who had been vocally critical of her office's internal oversight procedures in 2 published professional journal articles and who had therefore been flagged by Reyes as a potential internal ally. Morse picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant either she was always awake at 6:45 a.m. or someone had told her a call was coming. Deputy IG Morse, she said. Deputy Inspector General, this is Emily Walker. You don't know me. Emily looked at Reyes, who nodded. But you should know that a senior member of your office was used last night to generate fraudulent federal credentials for a facility breach operation targeting an active evidence authentication procedure. The name is Wallach. And the breach was coordinated using operational intelligence that we believe was passed through a DoD logistics coordinator whose name I'd like to give you. Silence on the line. Then, go ahead. Emily gave her the name. She heard writing. Where are you now? Morse asked. Hargrove Air National Guard Facility, Ashford, Oregon. Don't leave, Morse said, and the call ended. Reyes exhaled. Emily sat back. Her hands were on the table in front of her, and she looked at them for a moment. Still steady, same as always, and felt a deep, ordinary tiredness that had nothing operationally significant about it. Just a person who had been awake for nearly 24 hours and was running on the specific fuel of a situation that hadn't resolved enough to let her stop. The disposal contract records, she said. The auditors, what's their status? Reyes checked her laptop. Both operational. They've been running the disposal chain since 1 a.m. I have a preliminary summary if you want it. I want it. Reyes turned the laptop. The summary was dense. Names, contract numbers, billing cycle dates, aggregate figures. Emily read it the way she read lab results, looking for the pattern underneath the data rather than the data itself. The pattern was clean and ugly. Over 8 years, a series of defense contractors, some real, some shell entities like Aldermore, had been billing the DoD for the certified disposal of surplus pharmaceutical supplies from 3 forward operating bases. The certifications were falsified. The supplies hadn't been disposed. They'd been resold through a distribution chain that connected, if you followed it far enough, to a civilian pharmaceutical wholesaler operating out of 3 states. The medical procurement fraud from Emily's original testimony had been the input side of the operation. This was the output side. The same supplies, billed to the government on entry and billed again on fraudulent disposal, with the physical product disappearing into a civilian market that asked no questions about origin. $40 million. 8 years. And somewhere in the middle of it, 7 individuals whose names were now in Evidence Package Walker 7, who had known about both sides of the operation and had allowed it to continue, and 2 of whom were currently holding senior DoD appointments. She looked up from the screen. The 7 names in Walker 7. Reyes, have the formal notification warrants been drafted? Filed at 5 a.m., Dunbar countersigned before the debrief. So they're active. They're active. Emily closed the laptop gently. Then the next 6 hours are going to be interesting. At 8 a.m., Garrett Mulvey left the rental property on the east side of Ashford for the first time in 10 hours. Emily knew this because Fossey had quietly replaced Marsh's surveillance team at 7:15 a.m. with 2 agents she vouched for personally, and the replacement team had confirmed the original team's report must sort as accurate up until the point of Mulvey's departure, which meant the sedan had genuinely been stationary. Mulvey had simply been patient, waiting out the night the way someone waited out a storm, and now the storm had, from his perspective, either passed or arrived. He drove to a shopping center parking lot on the west side of town and sat in the car for 14 minutes. Fossey's team watched him make 2 phone calls. At 8:22, a second vehicle pulled into the lot and parked 2 spaces away. The individual who got out of the second vehicle was Nathan Cole. Emily watched this on a tablet feed from inside the facility communications room and felt something move through her that was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger. Something flatter and more certain than either. The particular feeling of a thing you'd suspected becoming a thing you knew. Cole looked nervous. He was wearing his weekend clothes, khakis, a jacket, the kind of dress down that was still instinctively put together. And he approached Mulvey's window with the body language of someone who had been told to do something and was doing it while being very aware that he'd rather not be. They spoke for 11 minutes. The surveillance team's audio equipment was good enough to capture fragments. Not a complete transcript, but enough, Cole's voice. Told me it was just an employment matter. Mulvey's voice quieter, harder to catch. Need the facility floor plans. Cole. I don't have facility floor plans. I'm a hospital administrator. Mulvey. Someone you know, who maintains the building systems at Silver Ridge. And then a long pause, and then Cole's voice again, different in quality, higher, thinner, the voice of a man understanding something he hadn't wanted to understand. What exactly are you people trying to do? The surveillance team noted that Mulvey's response was inaudible. They also noted that at 8:33 a.m., Cole got back in his car and drove directly to the Ashford field office of the FBI, walked in without an appointment, and asked to speak to an agent about a matter of national security. He was there for 3 hours. At 11:15 a.m., federal agents arrested Garrett Mulvey in the same parking lot where he'd been sitting in his car for 2.5 hours, waiting for a call that wasn't coming. He did not resist. He sat with his hands visible, and his expression the particular blankness of a man who had spent 16 months calculating and had discovered that the calculation had been wrong. Emily heard about the arrest through Fosse, who came to the communications room and said, "Mulvey's in custody," in the tone of someone reporting a weather update. Then she said, "Cole walked into the field office voluntarily. He's cooperating." "I know," Emily said. "I watched the parking lot feed." Fosse sat down. She looked, for the first time that Emily had observed, genuinely tired. Cole didn't know what he was involved in. He genuinely didn't. Mulvey used him the same way they use everyone. Found a pressure point, applied it carefully, kept him in the dark about the larger structure. "The pressure point being me," Emily said. "The pressure point being his own professional insecurity, which you happen to represent." Fosse was quiet for a moment. He walked into that FBI office, and the first thing he said was that he'd wrongfully terminated a nurse and that he thought it might be connected to something he didn't understand. He specifically asked about you by name. She paused again. "For whatever that's worth." Emily thought about this. About Cole with his folder and his golf tan and his very complete certainty that he understood the situation. He hadn't. He'd been a tool used by people who understood it much better than he did, and whatever else was true about him, the thing he'd done this morning, getting in his car and driving to the FBI rather than driving away, was the thing that mattered most. "It's worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." Both men. At 1 p.m., the warrants were executed. Emily wasn't present for any of it. She was still at Hargrove, which was where Fosse and Dunbar had asked her to remain, and where she remained because remaining was the operationally correct choice and not because anyone had made her. From the communications room, she received updates in the dry, factual format that federal operations reported in. Warrant served, individual taken into custody, location secured, no resistance. The 2 senior DOD officials whose names were in Walker 7, a logistics coordinator in the contracting office, 3 members of the billing structure's civilian distribution chain, and, at 2:47 p.m., after a longer and more complicated process involving his attorney and a separate federal judge in a different jurisdiction, a field operations coordinator in the DOD Inspector General's office named Wallach, who had spent the morning attempting to reach people who were no longer in positions to receive his calls. 7 arrests in 6 hours. At 3:15, Fosse came to find her with a different expression than she'd worn all day. Still tired, but with something under the tiredness that was closer to resolution. "Garrison," she said, without preamble. Emily looked at her. "He's been working with us," Fosse said. "Not Marsh's team, a separate FBI counterintelligence unit that Dunbar's been coordinating. He's been building the Aldermore case for 8 months. He was the one who flagged your hiring paperwork internally when he found the Aldermore connection, but the notification chain he used got intercepted, which is why you were never told." She paused. "The anonymous messages were him. He's been trying to keep you informed without breaking his own operational security." Emily absorbed this. The man Marsh had named as a suspect had been working the investigation from the inside, and Marsh had named him as a suspect. "Marsh," she said, "is not under arrest," Fosse said carefully. "The DOD filing last night, it went to a legitimate oversight coordinator. The coordinator's office shares an administrative system with the Logistics Review Office, and the system generated an automatic notification that the filing shouldn't have generated. It wasn't intentional." Emily looked at her steadily. "That's the finding," Fosse said. "The internal review found no intentional disclosure. The maintenance gap information was accessed by 3 individuals with facility authorization, including Marsh, but also including two others who are now being separately investigated. She met Emily's eyes. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking finding is a word that describes a conclusion that may or may not match the truth. I'm thinking, Emily said slowly, that a man who named Garrison as a suspect when Garrison was working a counterintelligence operation is either incompetent or something else, and Marsh is not incompetent. Fossey was quiet for a long moment. The finding is what it is. The investigation is ongoing. She held Emily's gaze. But the evidence is authenticated, the arrests are made, and you are no longer under threat from the individuals who are targeting you. Those three things are true regardless of what else is still in motion. Emily looked at the wall across from her. At the institutional beige of it, the utilitarian nothing of a government facility built for function and not for anything else. When do I have to give a formal statement? She said. Tomorrow morning, Federal Building in Portland. Reyes will be there, Dunbar will be there, and the JAG team will be there. And Marsh? Marsh has been relieved of operational oversight pending the ongoing review, Fossey said, effective 2 hours ago. The room was quiet. The heater ticked. Outside, she could hear vehicle movement. The controlled, systematic activity of a facility wrapping up an operation. There's one more thing, Fossey said. She set a folder on the table, not a digital file, an actual physical folder, the kind that implied a level of formality that digital files didn't convey. This came from JAG this morning. It's been in process for a while, apparently. The arrest today accelerated the timeline. Emily looked at the folder without opening it. It's a formal notification, Fossey said. The Military Record Review Board completed a full audit of your service record 6 weeks ago. Everything that was sealed or redacted following your testimony, the commendations, the operational citations, the promotion that was held pending the investigation. She paused. The board voted unanimously to restore the record in full. Emily put her hand on the folder, didn't open it. There's a formal ceremony, Fossey continued. They want to do it properly. The date is flexible. They said whenever you're ready. Emily sat with her hand on the folder and her eyes on the wall and felt something move through her that she couldn't have named precisely. The specific weight of a thing you'd carried so long that you'd stopped noticing the weight until the moment someone offered to help you set it down. Who requested the audit? She asked. Her voice was steady, which she was glad about. Fossey hesitated for just a moment. Corporal Brandt, from his hospital bed. He filed a formal request to JAG 2 days after the convoy incident. She paused. He said he wanted to know the name of the person who saved his life. Emily opened the folder. The first page was her service record, her complete service record, the version she'd never been allowed to see in full because portions of it had been sealed for her protection, which had always been the particular bureaucratic irony of her situation. The protection had required hiding the thing it was protecting. She read the first page, then the second. On the third page, below a list of operational citations she barely remembered earning because the earning of them had been mixed in with things she was actively trying not to die from, there was a handwritten note. It wasn't standard military documentation. It was a JAG officer's personal note clipped to the inside of the folder, 3 sentences. The record speaks clearly. This should not have taken 4 years. We're sorry it did. She closed the folder. From somewhere in the facility, she heard a door open and voices in the corridor and the particular sound of an operation concluding, people moving differently than they'd moved at 2 a.m., with less controlled urgency and more ordinary human tiredness, the sound of something being over. She was about to stand when her burner buzzed one final time. The message was from Garrison's number. She recognized it now, with context. Check Reyes's preliminary report. Page 7, footnote 4. The disposal contractor's billing agent. Cross-reference with your Silver Ridge employee directory. She looked at the message. Then she picked up her tablet and opened Reyes's preliminary report and turned to page 7 and found footnote 4, which referenced a billing agent named in the disposal contractor records, a name used as a contact point for 3 of the fraudulent certifications. She opened the Silver Ridge employee directory. The name appeared once, not in a medical role, not in administration, in the Facilities and Operations Department, hired 14 months ago, 3 months before Emily had arrived. The name in the directory was Terrence Voss, Facilities and operations. Hired 14 months ago with a resume that listed prior experience in commercial property management and contract logistics. The kind of background that fit unremarkably into a mid-sized hospital's operations department. The kind that nobody looked at twice because nobody looked at facilities staff twice. That was the point. That had always been the point. She called Garrison's number directly. He picked up on the first ring. "Voss," she said. "We found him 20 minutes ago." His voice was tired in a way that had nothing performative about it. He was already gone. Apartment cleaned out, personal vehicle abandoned at the Greyhound terminal on 5th. We have transit surveillance running now. He ran when the arrest started. Looks that way. He must have had a trigger. When Mulvey went dark, he moved. A pause. He's the last piece of the billing structure's physical presence in Ashford. The rest of the network is in custody or accounted for. Voss is a loose end, Emily said. A loose end with detailed knowledge of the disposal contractor's operations and the physical location of several individuals involved in this investigation. Garrison's voice was flat in the way of someone communicating urgency without performing it. We're treating his disappearance as a priority. She thought about Voss in the hospital's facilities department, walking the same corridors she'd walked, checking the same mechanical systems, knowing the layout of every floor, the location of every access point, the timing of every shift change. 14 months of building that knowledge while she'd been 8 months of building a different kind. The clinical kind. The kind that told you which attending lost focus under pressure and which charge nurse caught medication errors nobody else caught, and where the gaps were in a system that was trying its best with insufficient resources. 2 different kinds of watching, both patient, both purposeful. "He's not coming after me," she said. "Voss is operational support, not tactical. He'll run to ground and wait for instructions that aren't coming." "Probably," Garrison said, "but probably isn't good enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at the folder on the table. "Find him." "Working on it." Another pause, different in quality from the others. "Emily, the things I couldn't tell you, the operational constraints." "I know," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just the acknowledgement of a person who understood that constraints were real and also that they had costs. "We'll have a longer conversation about it when this is finished." "Fair enough." He ended the call. Voss was found at 6:40 p.m. at a truck stop 40 miles south of Ashford, attempting to negotiate a ride with a long-haul driver in the parking lot. He had $4,200 in cash in a backpack, a prepaid phone with 17 recent calls, all going to numbers that were already disconnected, and the particular expression of a man whose plan had assumed a network that no longer existed to receive him. He did not resist. He sat on the curb in the truck stop parking lot with his hands zip-tied in front of him and looked at the federal agent surrounding him with the blankness of someone running calculations that weren't resolving. Emily heard about it from Dunbar at 7:15 in the same flat operational update format as everything else. She was still at Hargrove, still in the communications room, because she'd stayed because there was nowhere else to be, and because the communications room had bad coffee and a chair that was at least structurally sound, which was more than she could say for her apartment. "That's everyone," Dunbar said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his jacket off and his tie loosened, and the expression of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and was only now allowing himself to feel it. "Not everyone," she said. Marsh is still under review," Dunbar said. "The investigation is ongoing." "That's not the same as everyone being caught, I know." He looked at her steadily. "But the network is dismantled. The funding mechanism is exposed. The individuals with operational capacity are in federal custody." He paused. "It's not clean. It never is. But it's done." She sat with this for a moment. Done was not the same as finished, and finished was not the same as resolved, and resolved was not the same as healed, and she knew the distances between each of those things better than most people. But done was real. Done was something you could stand on. "The formal statement tomorrow," she said. "Portland. 9 a.m. I'll drive." He pushed off the doorframe. "Go sleep. Actual sleep, not whatever you've been doing in that bunk room." She almost argued. Then she decided that arguing with Dunbar about sleep was a waste of operational energy, which was the closest thing to a joke she'd managed in 36 hours. She went to sleep. Mom. The formal statement took 4 hours. It was thorough and documented and conducted by people who asked good questions and listened to the answers without interrupting, which was more than she could say for most conversations she'd had in her adult life. Reyes was there, as promised. Dunbar was there. 2 JAG attorneys and a federal prosecutor whose name Emily already knew from the original prosecution 4 years ago, a woman named Hartley, who had the kind of institutional memory that made her dangerous to people who assumed the government forgot things. Cole's cooperation statement was referenced twice. Emily acknowledged it both times without comment, which was the most she was prepared to offer on the subject of Nathan Cole in a formal legal setting. In a less formal setting, she might have said that he was a man whose primary flaw was the very human one of believing that confidence and competence were the same thing, and that this flaw had made him useful to people who were genuinely malicious, which was a different category of problem than being malicious yourself. She might have said that. She didn't. At the end of the statement, Hartley looked at her across the table and said, "Staff Sergeant Walker, on behalf of the prosecution team, I want to acknowledge that this evidence has been preserved intact across 4 years and significant personal cost. What you maintained made this possible." Emily looked at her. "Do the right thing with it," she said. "That's all I need." What? The ceremony was 3 weeks later. Not at Hargrove. At a federal facility in Portland, which had a room that was slightly too formal for its size, flags, a podium, chairs arranged in rows, and which had been filled by a combination of JAG personnel, federal investigators, 2 members of Hartley's prosecution team, and in the back 2 rows, 7 soldiers from Marsh's convoy unit who were ambulatory enough to attend. Corporal Brandt was in the second row, still moving carefully, one arm in a brace, but sitting straight. Dominic Reyes, the paramedic from Silver Ridge, the one who'd told her Cole was documenting and had sat in the break room with a vending machine sandwich and called her a strange person, was there because Emily had called him herself and asked him to come, which had resulted in a silence on the phone that lasted about 5 seconds before he said, "Obviously," and hung up. She'd also called Celeste Reyes, which was a coincidence of surnames she'd stopped finding remarkable. Celeste was there in the 3rd row with her legal pad because apparently she brought the legal pad everywhere, which Emily had decided was not a flaw but a feature. The ceremony itself was not long. Military ceremonies rarely were, when they were done correctly. They said the necessary things with appropriate weight, and then they stopped because the necessary things didn't need padding. A general whose name Emily had known for years, but whose face she was seeing for the first time, read the citations aloud. She stood at attention in the front of the room and listened to her own record being read back to her. The operational deployments, the medical actions under fire, the testimony that had required 4 years of institutional limbo and 1 very bad 8 months in an underfunded ER in Ashford, Oregon, and felt the strange doubling of hearing your own history narrated by someone else. The way it was simultaneously accurate and somehow slightly beside the point. The commendations were pinned. The promotion was formalized. Her record was restored in full publicly with witnesses. When it was over, she shook hands with the general, who was professional and correct, and then said, off the record quietly, "It took too long. I want you to know that's not something we're satisfied with." "Thank you," she said, because she was not in the business of telling generals what she actually thought about institutional timelines, and also because what he'd said was true. And the acknowledgement of a true thing had its own value even when it didn't fix anything. Brandt found her afterward, moving carefully across the room on his own feet, because he'd refused the wheelchair Emily had noted parked near the door. He stopped in front of her and said nothing for a moment, and she recognized in his face the expression of someone who had been through a thing that language hadn't caught up to yet. "You kept talking to me," he said finally. "In the trauma bay. You kept telling me to stay with you. Standard protocol," she said. "It didn't feel like protocol." He held her gaze. "I filed the JAG request from the hospital. I wasn't sure it would do anything. I just thought—" He stopped. "I thought someone should know your name." Something moved in her chest that she didn't try to analyze. "It helped," she said. More than you know. He nodded, once, and extended his good hand. She shook it. Then he went back to his row, and she turned to find Dominic Reyes standing 6 feet away with the expression of a man who had driven 2 hours to attend a military ceremony for someone he'd known for 8 months, and was now uncertain whether he was in the right place. "Strange enough for you?" she asked. He looked around the room, the flags, the formal chairs, the general talking to JAG attorneys across the room. "Little bit, yeah." He paused. "You gonna tell me the whole story someday?" "Parts of it," she said. "Fair." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "For what it's worth, I told everyone at Silver Ridge, after Cole got removed. I told them what happened and what you'd done and what you actually were." He paused. "Some of them weren't surprised. The residents you worked with that morning, they already knew something was different about you. They just didn't have words for it. And now they do. Now they have a lot of words for it," he said. "Most of them are complimentary." She almost smiled. "Most of them." "Harmon says you were insubordinate," Reyes said, but he said it in a tone that suggested he'd recategorized insubordinate as a compliment. This time she did smile, briefly, which surprised her slightly. 8 months of Harmon and his wounded attending's dignity, and now apparently he'd decided that being outperformed by someone he'd tried to sideline was a story that reflected well on his instincts. That was very human. She couldn't even find it irritating. Well, Cole had resigned from Silver Ridge the day after his cooperation statement, which was both inevitable and, as these things went, probably the most self-aware decision he'd made in the entire sequence of events. His medical license review was ongoing. The prosecution for abuse of authority and obstruction was proceeding, and Hartley's office was being careful about the obstruction charge given the evidence that Cole's actions had been manipulated rather than independent. But careful didn't mean absent, and the process was the process. He had sent Emily a letter, an actual letter, paper, handwritten. She'd received it 2 days after the ceremony, forwarded through Fosse's office because her Ashford address was no longer something she was using. It was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged what he'd done and what it had cost her. The second acknowledged that he'd never understood who she was or what she was capable of, and that this failure of perception had made him useful to people with bad intentions. The third paragraph was a single sentence. "I don't expect this to matter much, but I wanted you to know I understand what I got wrong." She read it twice. Then she put it in a folder that she was keeping, not for legal purposes, just because she'd decided that keeping a record of the moments when people surprised her, in either direction, was something she wanted to do. The records from Evidence Package Walker 7 were entered into federal proceedings 6 days after the ceremony. The 2 senior DoD officials were formally charged with conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of military justice. The billing structure's principals faced a combined 47 counts across multiple jurisdictions. Hartley's office estimated full proceedings would take 2 years, which was a long time by any individual's reckoning and a short time relative to the 8 years the fraud had run uninterrupted. Voss was charged with conspiracy and material support of fraud. He cooperated, partially, in exchange for a reduced recommendation, which Hartley accepted because partial cooperation from someone with operational knowledge was worth more than the satisfaction of refusing it. He would serve time. Not as much as he deserved, possibly, but time nonetheless, inside a system that would have records of what he'd done and why. The internal review of Marsh's operational conduct concluded without criminal charges, which Dunbar told her about with the expression of someone delivering information they understood she'd receive with mixed feelings. She received it with mixed feelings. The review had found insufficient evidence of intentional disclosure. The DoD filing's automatic notification had been determined to be a system error rather than a deliberate action, and the maintenance gap access had been attributed to one of the 2 other individuals with facility authorization. She was not certain this was wrong. She was also not certain it was right. She filed it in the category of things she would never fully resolve and moved forward, because the alternative to moving forward with uncertainty was standing still in it, and she'd done enough of that. The military emergency trauma program was Reyes' idea. Celeste Reyes, the JAG investigator with the legal pad, who had apparently spent 3 weeks between the arrests and the ceremony drafting a proposal that she presented to Silver Ridge's interim administration and the regional military health authority simultaneously and with a thoroughness that had made both institutions say yes before they'd fully processed what they were agreeing to. Emily found out about it when Celeste called her directly, which was efficient and characteristic. Director of Emergency Preparedness, Celeste said, Civilian Military Collaborative, training protocols, mass casualty response frameworks, integration between the ER and the Guard facility's medical resources. A pause. I put your name in the proposal. I probably should have asked first. You probably should have, Emily said. Do you want the position or not? Emily stood at her apartment window, a different apartment, different city, still third floor out of habit, and looked at the street below and thought about what she wanted, which was a question she hadn't asked herself directly in a long time because the operational circumstances had made asking it feel like a luxury. What she wanted was to be useful in a way that didn't require hiding what she was. What she wanted was the work itself, the specific, demanding, consequential work of being the person in the room who knew what to do when everything was falling apart, without the layer of performance on top of it, without the careful management of what she let people see. She was tired of being underestimated. Not because it had been hard, exactly. She'd used it. She'd been trained to use it. She'd even found a kind of dark professional satisfaction in it. But because it was exhausting in the particular way of carrying weight that you didn't need to carry and that served no one. Yes, she said, I want it. Good, Celeste said. The interim director at Silver Ridge wants to meet next week, and Brandt's unit is running a training exercise in February. They've requested you personally for the medical component. February works, Emily said. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a while longer. The street below was ordinary. Cars, pedestrians, the particular unremarkable aliveness of a city going about its day without any awareness of the specific threads that had run through it and under it and been pulled apart and rewoven over the last several weeks. That was fine. That was how it should be. The work that kept those ordinary days ordinary was not supposed to be visible. The people doing it were not supposed to need the recognition to do it, but that didn't mean recognition was nothing. She'd learned that belatedly, in the front row of a room with flags and a General and Corporal Brandt in his brace and Dominic Reyes with his hands in his pockets. The work was the thing. The work had always been the thing. And being seen for the work, being called by your actual name and your actual record, that wasn't vanity. That was accuracy. And accuracy, in the field she'd spent her life in, was what the difference between living and not living often came down to. She had been dismissed. She had been documented and managed and finally terminated by a man who'd seen her as a liability before he'd looked long enough to see anything else. She had been placed in a city by people who'd used her as a resource without fully accounting for her as a person. She had spent 4 years carrying a sealed package of evidence that named people with power and had lived inside the specific patience that required, the patience of someone who knows the truth and cannot yet say it, and has to decide every single day that the day will eventually come when they can. The day had come. She picked up the folder with her restored service record and her commendations and the JAG attorney's handwritten 3 sentences and put it in a box she was keeping rather than shipping to storage. Not many things made that box. This did. Then she picked up her phone and called Celeste back. The training protocols for the mass casualty response framework, she said. I want to write them myself, not adapt existing ones, write new ones based on what actually happens in those rooms rather than what the literature says happens. That's more work, Celeste said. I know what it is. A pause. Okay, I'll put it in the scope. One more thing, Emily said. The 3 enlisted personnel whose statements are in Walker 7, when the proceedings start and their names become part of the record, they're going to need support. Not just legal, the kind of support that comes from someone who's been in the same position. You're volunteering. I'm telling you it needs to happen. Whether I do it or someone better suited does it, it needs to happen. She paused. But I'll do it. She could hear Celeste writing, the sound of the legal pad, the particular scratch of a pen moving across paper in the hand of someone who took things seriously enough to write them down. Noted, Celeste said. Emily ended the call. She stood in the room that was hers now, with its third-floor window and its view of an ordinary street. And she was not the version of herself who had driven into Ashford 8 months ago with boxes she hadn't unpacked and a cover identity she'd worn like clothing that didn't quite fit. She was also not the version of herself that existed in the sealed records, or the formal citations, or the general's careful language at the ceremony. She was something more difficult than either of those. More human, more tired, more intact. She thought about what it cost to stay quiet when you knew the truth. Not the operational cost, not the strategic calculation. The human cost. The daily weight of being precisely what you are and performing something smaller. She'd done it because it was necessary, and she'd do it again under the same circumstances. But she was glad, with a gladness that didn't have much to do with ceremonies or citations, that she didn't have to do it anymore. The strongest thing she'd ever done was not the testimony or the evidence preservation or the 40 minutes in a trauma bay keeping a young soldier alive with her hands. The strongest thing was the 8 months of being told she was less than she was and choosing every single day not to believe it. Not because she'd been waiting for vindication. She hadn't been sure vindication was coming, but because the truth of what you are doesn't require an audience to be true. She'd always known who she was. It just turned out the rest of the world needed a little longer to catch up. She put on her jacket, picked up her keys, and walked out the door toward whatever came next. Not looking back, not because the past didn't matter, but because she'd finally finished carrying it the hard way.